Welcome to the Mano podcast. I'm George Laws Garcia, Executive Director of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council. In today's episode, we welcome Christina Ponsa-Kraus, Professor of Legal History at Columbia Law School. A native of Puerto Rico, she is a leading scholar of constitutional law and American legal history, focusing on U.S. territorial expansion and the political status of Puerto Rico and other U.S. territories. Her work examines questions of federalism, citizenship, and nationhood, and she is co-editor of the landmark volume Foreign in a Domestic Sense, Puerto Rico, American Expansion, and the Constitution. On today's episode, we explore how Puerto Rico's history and legal battles shape today's movement for decolonization and self-determination. We discuss the Puerto Rico Status Act, the meaning of sovereignty, the rise of autonomism, and the democratic deficit inherent to the island's current territorial status. Finally, we look at what it will take to advance the cause of statehood and build national visibility for Puerto Rico's future. Welcome, Christina, to the Mano a Mano podcast. We're so happy to have you.
I am very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, Christina, let's get right into it. Can you tell us just a little bit about your work at Columbia Law School as a professor and how it's connected to this issue of Puerto Rico's territory status and the efforts to resolve the island's political question?
Sure. So I teach constitutional law and legal history at Columbia, and my own scholarly specialty is the constitutional history of American empire, the territories and expansion and colonial governance by the United States. But I would say, even though that's my specialty, really everything I do is relevant to Puerto Rico's status issue. And frankly, Puerto Rico status issue is a better way to put it, is relevant to everything I do. So when I teach the regular first year foundational constitutional law course, I am constantly thinking, here's American federalism, here's how the Constitution works, here's what rights the states have, what rights they don't have, what the federal government can and can't do. And, there's a voice in my head saying, well, except for Puerto Rico. Well, if Puerto Rico has representation, well, this doesn't apply in Puerto Rico. Well, we don't have this right yet. And I will often bring it into class because it's something that students aren't ordinarily taught.
Yeah, and I think that's super important because unfortunately, that's not an education that people usually get when they go to high school or even most universities. They don't really have, that asterisk that you're talking about or that footnote that you're talking about, which shows that, this is how the system applies for the Constitution for the states, for DC, for everyone else. But then we have this entire group and class of U.S. citizens that are treated, differently. So one question that I have for you is, what's a question that you commonly get from your students? What are they interested in knowing, and what do you tell them?
I think the most common one I get from the students who aren't familiar with the situation, once we've talked about it for a while, is, are you kidding? But that's probably not the kind of question you had in mind. So I'm fortunate to have a few students from Puerto Rico on a regular basis, but I, more than that, have students who have not encountered this issue, have vaguely heard about it. And I'd say the question I get most often is, how could this still be happening?
Yeah.
What do you mean Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States and has been a colony of the United States since it was annexed in 1898? How's that possible? And then a lot of questions flow from that. But I'd say that's the most common one.
That's super interesting. I'll tell you something fascinating. Just this morning, I took my daughter to her middle school for the open house. She starts school next week. And we went into the classroom where she'll be learning social studies and history and geography. And there was a map of the United States on the wall. It had Alaska and Hawaii, the upper 48 and DC. And Puerto Rico was missing from that map. So in a certain sense, even with my own child, I'm seeing how our educational system is actually purposefully, excluding and not really showing that, Puerto Rico is a part of the United States that we are subject to the same laws, that we're United States citizens. And, it's evidenced directly by something as concrete as a map. And that's just devastating. So in a sense, even at the college level, you're now having to remediate all of this education that is just not happening earlier on.
That's right. That's right. It's really just built into the culture, built into the DNA of the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico and the other territories, because there's 5 total. Puerto Rico is just the biggest one by a lot.
Exactly.
But that relationship has always involved the United States rendering the territories invisible, setting them aside, giving them, it's always an exception. And so it doesn't come into people's consciousness, and then it doesn't get taught, and then people don't understand it, and then people don't end up caring about it, and then they don't put pressure on the federal government to do something. So it's part of how the whole colonial dynamic works, really, is that erasure, that map. I'm so familiar with that experience. You look at that map, and there's a scholar who's Daniel Immerwahr, who's called it the logo map. Like, that's the logo. Yeah. And then he's written about how much is missing from it. So he's one of the scholars who have paid attention. But yes, very familiar experience, that map, and then the boxes of Alaska and Hawaii, and where are we?
Where's the rest of it? Yeah, I'm familiar with his work. I think one of the books is called How to Hide an Empire. And, part of how you hide it is you just don't show it on the map, right?
Exactly. That's step 1 in the instruction manual for how to hide your empire.
Well, one of the things that, one of the reasons why we wanted to interview you is because your work goes beyond just what you do in academia. And actually, you've played a significant role in helping to shape this debate on Puerto Rico's political status and the different mechanisms that Congress and the federal government should consider to reckon with this issue of territorial colonialism and the responsibility that the U.S. federal government has to address this unfinished business of American democracy, this democratic deficit, which is still very much present. Now, in the last 2 sessions of Congress, the Puerto Rico Status Act was introduced, and this legislation, which you had a protagonistic role in helping to draft the precursor to it, right? The bill that eventually became the Puerto Rico Status Act. It would provide for a vote between the 3 non-territorial, non-colonial options of statehood, independence, and it was called sovereignty and free association in the bill, but in reality, it's basically a form of independence in free association with the United States. Can you speak to us about your insights and reflections from that process that resulted in the passage of the Puerto Rico Status Act through the U.S. House of Representatives in 2022?
Well, I appreciate your ending that question with its passage, because there were highs and lows.
Definitely.
Many highs and lows, and that was absolutely a high when it passed, but there were lows as well. That process is, I strongly believe, with all of its flaws, no process is perfect. That process was, I believe, how we need to solve this problem. So it started with Puerto Ricans in Congress disagreeing with each other, as always.
Classic.
It's classic, it's frustrating, but people are entitled to disagree. People have different ideas about how to solve the status problem. And, it's classic, right? One way you keep people subordinate is you divide and conquer. The United States divided and conquered and keeps dividing. And the way they divide us, right? We have our respective preferences, be it statehood or independence, or this independence with free association option. But the way they keep us divided is by not doing their part, by not coming in and saying, okay, let's work together. Here's what the options are. Here's what we could do to implement them. We will implement one when you choose it. Now let's go. Let's work through this together. So there we are. It's back in when this all started. Well, when that phase of it started. This all started a bunch of centuries ago. But when this particular phase of it started,
episode, yeah,
we were, Puerto Ricans were divided. There were 2 competing bills, And
And this is in 2021,
yes,
after the statehood yes or no vote had happened in November 2020.
exactly. So in November 2020, statehood yes or no, statehood wins. It's a clear majority. It's a slim majority, but it's a clear majority. And so there are now two bills in Congress competing with each other. One is a bill that would admit Puerto Rico into statehood after a second vote. The other is a bill that would send Puerto Ricans back to the drawing board by organizing another constitutional convention on the island. We already had one mid-20th century, and forcing us to define our options all over again and letting Congress off the hook. And I testified in a couple of hearings, and I thought, we're just going nowhere. We're here at each other's throats, and Congress can easily say, these people can't agree with each other, forget it. And I just couldn't stand seeing that happen again. And I had a colleague, another scholar, on the opposing side. He's against statehood. I'm for statehood. We got together and we said, there's got to be a compromise way. And we know there's got to be a compromise way because there's so much we agree on, even though we disagree on the final option. He wants that free association option. That's a form of independence. He doesn't describe it that way, but it's free association. And I want statehood. And so we got together and reached wrote up a consensus in the process. And the bottom line of that process was, let's put down in clear detail for the voters to see all of the, as you said, non-territorial, which means non-colonial options. That's what should be on the ballot. That's what people should be able to vote on. And so you asked for insights, and I guess there's a bunch, but one is it's possible for people to work together across their differences and find a way forward in which everyone has a fair opportunity to express their view, and then a majority in a transparent and fair process, because that's key, can choose an option that can decolonize Puerto Rico. It is possible. If this colleague of mine and I could collaborate, people can collaborate across profound differences. And then another insight was, frankly, one that every encounter with Congress brings, although I would say this was the best version of that encounter with Congress that I experienced. But, that if we can't get together and sustain a collaboration and demand congressional action together, it's really going to be nearly impossible to see change. And so lots of factions worked together to get that bill passed in the House. Then, as you know, it died in the Senate. But even as we did, at every step, it was a reminder, we can't undermine each other. You can't put your option above a fair process that gives everybody an opportunity to express their preference. If you put your option ahead of others and you try to undermine others, they've divided us and conquered us again. Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating, and I think super helpful. A question that I think has come up recently because after this most recent election, where Puerto Rico voted for statehood yet again, right? And it did so based on a plebiscite which presented the options that were included in the Puerto Rico Status Act. They literally copied the exact language from the House passed bill and included it on the ballot. Statehood won, yet we also elected a member to the U.S. House of Representatives, the resident commissioner, from the political party in Puerto Rico that supports continuing as a territory or improving that in some way. They call the territory a Commonwealth. What is a Commonwealth, and is it really different from territory status, or what's the difference there?
The question of what is a Commonwealth is the question that has plagued, haunted, harassed, tried to subdue me, but failed my whole life, and especially my professional life. So, as you say, Puerto Rico is currently officially known as a Commonwealth. no one has really very successfully defined it. And the reason is that it's a label that the United States put on a territory. So Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States. What's that? A territory of the United States is a jurisdiction, a place like Puerto Rico and several other islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific that is subject to what is known as the plenary power of Congress. The plenary, that word plenary just means absolute. So absolute, not in terms of, violating people's rights left and right. They can't do that. Absolute in terms of they have total control of how much self-government Puerto Rico has. So under the territory clause of the Constitution, Congress has the power to govern territories, and that power has always included, since the beginning of the Republic and the Northwest Ordinance, which people do learn about in high school, briefly, but they do. The Northwest Ordinance was this law that Congress passed in the beginning of the Republic, right after we adopted the Constitution, and it created a government for the territories. And Congress has always created governments for the territories. When it does that, it gives them a little more self-government or a little less self-government. Congress gets to decide. That's where Congress has plenary power. So what happens with Puerto Rico is, at first, when Puerto Rico's annexed in 1898, everyone knows it's a territory. That's what happens when you get annexed. You're a territory. Subject to the plenary power of Congress. Congress creates a government. The governor's appointed by the president with consent. There's an appointed council that advises the governor, and then there's an elected lower house. So they give us a little bit of democracy, but not a lot. A little bit of self-government, but not a lot. And over time, they increase it a little bit, but not a lot. Congress keeps the reins of power. That's what Congress does with territories. And then in 1950, Congress gives Puerto Rico permission to adopt its own constitution. So now Puerto Rico is going to look kind of like a State of the Union. It's going to have a local constitution that provides for the island's local government. But in other ways, it's not going to look at all like a state, because it's still not going to have senators or representatives or the ability to vote in presidential elections. That's what they called Commonwealth. So the way I think of Commonwealth, what Commonwealth is, the way to explain Commonwealth is what the United States did when it wanted to give Puerto Rico a little more self-government without making it a state. It's like fake statehood.
Yeah, so, if you look at Puerto Rico's constitution, read through the text of it, structurally, it looks like a state constitution. You've got an elected governor, an elected legislature with a House and a Senate, and then you've got a judiciary that gets, nominated by the governor and then confirmed in the Senate. So it's kind of, the same, federal type of, the same separation of powers structure that you have in most states, right? But what you're missing then is the link to how government exercises its power and responsibility and accountability at the federal level. Because at the federal level, what does Puerto Rico have under the current territory status or the Commonwealth?
In terms of representation, it has nothing. So what it has is Congress can pass laws that apply to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has no voice. Puerto Rico has no say. The president can adopt policies that affect Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has no vote. Puerto Rico has no say. So the states have federalism, right? This dual system of self-government where they have local government that is at the state level under a state constitution, and then they have a voice in the federal government through participation in federal elections and through Congress, the Senate, which represents states as states, and the House, which represents the people. Puerto Rico doesn't have that level. It's got the local part, but it doesn't have the federal part, which means we're still subject to the plenary power of Congress, which means Congress still has the power to give us more or take some away, modify it, do this, do that, as you know, they have recently done by creating the Federal Oversight and Management Board and giving it powers even over Puerto Rico's legislature and president. So Commonwealth. It sounds nice. It's a word that evokes the image of a self.
It sounds like Virginia or Pennsylvania or Kentucky, right?
Exactly. These commonwealths, these self-governing polities, okay? Sounds good. Not so good in reality.
Yeah. Well, that's really helpful for a significant reason, and it's because with the election of Pablo José Hernández, who's the current resident commissioner of Puerto Rico, who comes from the Popular Democratic Party, who's the party who's promoted this idea of the Commonwealth being kind of the best of both worlds. You don't have, the responsibilities of a state, and you get some level of local autonomy. So you get to kind of, have your cake and eat it too. In their view, the biggest flaw with the Puerto Rico Status Act is that their preferred option, the Commonwealth, was not, on the ballot. It was not an option that was presented there. So one question that I have for you is, why did the Puerto Rico Status Act exclude the Commonwealth or the current territory status?
So the basic insight behind not only the Puerto Rico Status Act, but any legitimate process of decolonization is that you can't vote to remain a colony. Not even the people, not even by going to the ballot. A majority can't choose to be a colony. And that the reason is, you choose to be a colony, you're forcing that on yourself, which you shouldn't do. You're forcing it on the people who oppose it, which you shouldn't do. Okay? You're insisting that a colonizer keep you as a colony. That's not the way decolonization works. So in order to decolonize, you need to have a process that leads to a non-colonial option, a legitimate, non-territorial, in Puerto Rico's case, option. And so the supporters of Commonwealth will say majorities of Puerto Ricans for a long time in the past, not recently, but for a long time in the past, voted for Commonwealth. This is the people's will. And the answer to that is, number one, I believe that people have been misled about what Commonwealth is. That's why they keep voting for it. They don't think they're voting to remain a colony. If you ask them, do you want to remain a colony? If you ask them, do you want to remain a territory? They say no. So,
and that's literally what happened in 2012. It happened again in 2017. And in that, statehood yes or no vote, it happened again there as well, because in 2012, voters were specifically asked, do you want to continue under current territory status? And the no vote won, right? And in 2017, they asked them whether they wanted statehood, independence, with or without free association, or staying as a territory, and, statehood won again. And then in 2020, it was statehood yes or no. And if you chose no, you basically stayed as a territory. So territory status has also been rejected by voters 3 times in, the last several votes.
That's right. And these votes have helpfully made it explicit. But voters have been voting against being a territory since the beginning, since they voted on these options. The Commonwealth Party defines Commonwealth as non-territorial. They're wrong. It is territorial. And I think in recent years, that's become crystal clear, starting first and foremost with the Supreme Court saying repeatedly, Puerto Rico is a territory. It's a territory with a constitution and local self-government, but it is a territory. Okay? And with Congress treating it like a territory in the way that it created this board and designated it a part of the territorial government. So Puerto Rico is simply a territory in both sort of in law, in doctrine, and in brute fact. The Commonwealth Party doesn't like that, doesn't want it. And for a while, they got away with saying Commonwealth isn't territorial. And that's what people voted for when majorities voted for Commonwealth. It finally became clear that, wait a second, Commonwealth sounds nice, but it really is territorial. We really still are a colony. Congress still has control over how much self-government we have. And at that point, people started rejecting Commonwealth. So there's still some smaller percentage of people who support it, and they still have leaders who are trying to sell that vision again. But that vision misleads the people, and it is an insistence in allowing them to choose something that subordinates them permanently.
Yeah, and you know what? It's fascinating because the reality is that with the advances that have been made on this issue up until now in Congress and over the last couple of decades, they've all happened under resident commissioners that have supported statehood for Puerto Rico, right? So over the last 20 years. Now, that all changed in January when Pablo José Hernández was elected as the first resident commissioner from the Popular Democratic Party since Aníbal Acevedo Vilá in the early 2000s. And although he claimed, Hernández claimed that he was not going to address the status issue, that he wasn't coming to Congress for that, we've actually seen a pattern of continuing to bring the issue up. And when he does, he's always basically negating, the will of voters and, saying that the reality is they didn't, actually vote for statehood. And, it's very quite messy. But what I'm really interested in getting your insight on is the explanation that he gives voters in Puerto Rico. And last July 25th was the 73rd anniversary of that Commonwealth Constitution that you talked about that, got approved in 1952. And at the event for his political party, he gave a very long speech in which he basically advocated for Puerto Rico to maintain its current status as a Commonwealth, and he declared himself an autonomist, right? And he was talking about autonomy as really being kind of the key central pillar to the ideology of his political party, which he thinks is, a new path forward for Puerto Rico. And, in his speech, he defined autonomy as the greatest amount of local self-government that a quote unquote country can have within the constitutional structure of another country. And then he gave this whole explanation of the history of this, hearkening it back to the 19th century when Puerto Rico was a colony of Spain and all of this. And I thought it would be incredibly helpful, given the fact that I understand you wrote a whole chapter in a book about this topic. If you could actually help give us some historical perspective about where the term autonomism and autonomist comes from and how that, connects with what's happening today.
Absolutely. This term autonomy, it's like the Commonwealth Party sees that it sounds good too. It does sound good because it's about having self-government, control over your life, autonomy. We use it to refer to individuals as well as states, as well as in other contexts. So they have for a long time tried to claim the term, and I think Hernández is trying to revive that effort. But it does have a long history, as you say. Puerto Rico has had an autonomist movement in one form or another, really since the beginning of the 19th century. And throughout most of the 19th century, what autonomists in Puerto Rico wanted was greater self-government under Spain. They really didn't have self-government under Spain. Spain ruled the island with an iron fist. It was a colony then too. And Spain was an even more repressive government in most ways than the United States was, although the ways in which the United States then echoed what Spain did are disappointing, let's put it that way. So in the 19th century, Puerto Rican autonomists really struggled for several things. Some of them just wanted to be an equal province of Spain.
Yeah.
They argued for that. They admired the political thinker Francisco Pi y Margall, who was a leading Spanish federalist, who himself argued that Spain should adopt the federalist model of the United States and give equal provincial status to the colonies, Cuba and Puerto Rico. So that was a vision. It's it's the precursor to statehooders today under the United States. That's full and equal integration in a federalist system, a form of autonomy. States think of themselves as having autonomy because they do. That's a form of autonomy. Then there was another form of autonomy that others, and sometimes there was overlap, also struggled for, and that was some kind of special status that would mean greater local self-government, but Puerto Rico would still be a part of Spain. And that group basically, felt that we'd never get equal integration, as a province of Spain. So instead of fighting for it, which would have been, one way to respond to that level of pessimism, they fought for special laws. And Spain itself would say, well, we're not going to give you equality, but we'll give you special laws. And indeed, Spain adopted several constitutions. Spain had constitutions on and off throughout the 19th century. It adopted several constitutions with provisions that said, we'll pass special laws, that phrase, leyes especiales, for the colonies, like someday. So similar.
So we're going to enumerate the rights for everyone else, but for you, we'll deal with you at another point, and we won't say what that is.
The usual. You guys have to wait. And
so, kind of sounds like the plenary powers there, no?
Sounds a lot like plenary powers. I was going to say, similar to the territory clause, it's Congress has the power to govern. That amounts to we have the power to govern too. We'll give you special laws when we get around to it. So by the end of the 19th century, you have a Partido Autonomista, an actual political party formed by the autonomists. The several factions get together and form a party because they at least agree, okay, what we need to do is band together and try.
And this is Román Valdoriotti de Castro.
Valdoriotti de Castro is the founder, and then you've got Federico Degetau y González is one of the leaders, the one that I find more sympathetic, Luis Muñoz Rivera, who is in the end a sort of, the forefather to the father of the actual father of the father of Commonwealth status, Luis Muñoz Marín. That's the political leader who in the mid-20th century led the Commonwealth movement. Well, his father, Luis Muñoz Rivera, was an autonomist, and they disagreed on this. All of them thought something would be better than nothing, but they disagreed as to whether autonomy just means local power for us Puerto Ricans. Okay, that was Luis Muñoz Rivera's view, was let's get it however we can, okay? Let's just make friends with the king if we have to. Let's just get autonomy. Or the view that Degetau espoused, which was autonomy means a Republican form of government and genuine power for the people through a voice and representation.
So when you say power for the people, it actually makes me think about another political and legal term that gets thrown around a lot in this topic, which is sovereignty, right? So one of the things that happened in the campaign and plebiscite around the options that were presented in the Puerto Rico Status Act, which eventually made it to the ballot in Puerto Rico last November, is that individuals who supported independence, or the version of independence called free association, right? Which is a form of independence where the separate country has a treaty with the United States. And the free part about it is that at any point, that treaty can essentially be dismantled and you get full independence, right? So those folks claimed and used the terminology that what Puerto Rico really needs is sovereignty, right? And then the language that they use to talk about statehood is that statehood is like assimilation or annexation, right? And that's kind of fascinating to me because in claiming the word sovereignty, if you look at the origin of the word, what it really means is that the power rests with the people, right? And what you're telling me then is that from Degetau's perspective, that vision of autonomy meant that was there a certain form of sovereignty within statehood? Does statehood mean sovereignty?
Yes, it does. But let me back up and say that word sovereignty. Earlier, you referred to Hernández's sort of about face, saying he's not going to address status, and then, of course, addressing it as messy.
Sure.
And I wanted to say, well, there's a flattering way of describing telling people you're not going to pursue status-related issues and then doing it anyway. Messy applies to sovereignty as well, and it is a flattering way of putting the debates about what sovereignty means. It's another term that sounds nice, and it does all these terms refer to something real. The question is, does your situation map onto the reality? So absolutely, the idea that Degetau espoused, which was we want not just power for locally for Puerto Ricans, but we want to make sure that it's under a Republican form of government, so that it is genuine power, genuinely popular power. Okay, we want to. There's a Republican form of government, of course, involves representative government, but a Republican form of government is not subjection to the total power of a king or a Congress with plenary power, okay? And so the getting genuine sovereignty for the people really requires true, full self-government. And full self-government under the control of a government, of another government, a higher government in which you're not represented, that can't be genuine sovereignty either. That can't be genuine sovereignty. So I would say the autonomists in the 19th century, I wanted to mention, because you pointed to Hernández's argument that autonomy is self-government for one country within another country. What the 19th century autonomists, the phrase they used to describe the autonomy they had in mind was decentralization, the maximum decentralization within national unity. They meant unity with Spain, okay? So wanting independence is perfectly legitimate, don't get me wrong.
Of course.
Independence is a legitimate decolonized status. There were some separatists as well. There were some separatists in the 19th century. They were few. They were persecuted very aggressively by Spain. So who knows what would have been the case if that hadn't happened. But the overwhelming majority of politically sort of active Puerto Ricans who were involved in this debate wanted autonomy, which they conceived of as, we are Spaniards and we have self-government. Okay, so then they had their various visions for how to do it. But this idea that it's one country within another country or one nation within another nation, well, look, in the abstract, there's really nothing wrong with that either. It depends on what nation you're talking about and how its government works and what that means for you and your power. And when you have Commonwealth supporters saying, well, we're the autonomists because we want the autonomy of a country within another country, and what they mean is local self-government, no federal representation, they're talking out of both sides of their mouths. I mean, it's not autonomy and it's not sovereignty if you're subject to that kind of power on the part of another government.
Yeah, and I think that insight is fascinating. And I do think that in some interesting way, Hernández's speech does leave the space for the possibility of some common ground with the ideologies that have sought to have Puerto Rico exit the territory clause and the plenary powers and achieve sovereignty, whether that's through independence through association, or statehood. And it's because he did mention in his speech one really important thing, which is he recognized the democratic deficit. Mm-hmm. And then he recognized that is something that needs to be remedied. Mm-hmm.
I just want to interrupt you and say, I just emphasize that point. Of course, we want out from under the territory clause, as he's confirming that. All of us have always wanted it. All of us are against colonialism. All of us want out. And we all recognize that there's a democratic deficit, as you explained, as long as you're a territory, as long as Congress has that kind of power over you, as long as you don't have genuine self-government that they can't take away, and genuine self-government in which you have a voice and a vote in the laws that apply to you, if you don't have that, you've got a democratic deficit. That's right. So it's a good thing that he recognizes that. And then what we need to try to work toward some kind of ground about what that means, and therefore what the options ought to be that people can vote on.
Yeah, definitely. So one additional piece about the history that I wanted to get your feedback on before we move to current day, and describing a little bit more, what that democratic deficit looks like operationally. Going back to this idea of, how the folks that support independence with or without free association talk about statehood, and the folks that support, Commonwealth status and how they talk about statehood. So the autonomists or the pro-sovereignty folks, right, if you want to kind of put them in those two camps, there is one common element that both of those camps have about how they view statehood for Puerto Rico. And their fundamental critique is that, statehood would be an abandonment of Puerto Rican culture and identity. And, I'm really interested to get your perspective. Did the autonomists of the 19th century see Puerto Rico, achieving statehood as something that would be, abandoning, Puerto Rican culture and identity?
Not at all. And this is where you have to, kind of smile to yourself when they lay claim to that legacy. The late 19th century autonomists, they're fascinating, because they had a vision and an understanding of American constitutionalism that was so capacious, so broad, so inclusive, that really we ought to learn from it now. So what ends up happening, Degetau and Muñoz Rivera are having this fight, how exactly do we get to autonomy, and what do we have to make sure it really means on the ground? They're having their debate. Cuba starts a war of independence against Spain. The United States intervenes. At the last minute, Cuba says, okay, we'll give you autonomy, which A, they could take away if they wanted to, and B, it's very last minute. Next thing you know, the United States annexes Puerto Rico. Spain is out. Autonomy, the last minute grant of autonomy is withdrawn. Now what? And in the first couple of years, really, of the U.S. occupation of Puerto Rico, it was initially a military occupation, before a civil government was established. And in that first period, the autonomists all came together around the goal of statehood within the United States. And, you don't see them saying, wait a second, now that Spain's gone and the United States is here, we're going to cease being Puerto Ricans. No, you get them saying, you know what? This is a path to the kind of autonomy we've all been seeking. Obviously, statehood is that. You have representation in the federal government, you have local self-government, you have your own constitution, you have that constitution as well. It's a balance of national unity and autonomy. They all wanted statehood. They put it in their party platforms. This was a point of consensus. What ends up happening?
And Degetau ended up being the first resident commissioner of Puerto Rico, right?
Degetau ends up being the first resident commissioner of Puerto Rico. From Puerto Rico, so he has to, put up with the indignity of representing Puerto Rico without a vote, but at least he's there to do what he can to empower Puerto Rico, and he tries to promote equality and statehood.
And also United States citizenship. Didn't he also introduce the first bill in Congress to grant full U.S. citizenship to the people of Puerto Rico?
Indeed, and he also looked, his story is so interesting, if you just want to find a kindred spirit, trying to find every way, how do I help my people? How do I empower my people? How do I get attention? How do I get us a voice? He looked for opportunities to establish that Puerto Ricans had become U.S. citizens when the United States annexed them. If you're annexed by a country, well, then it's supposed to grant you citizenship and the basic rights that come with it. And so he was involved in litigation. He wrote amicus briefs. He lobbied various departments of the government. He worked in every way he could to gain citizenship for Puerto Ricans with the longer term vision of gaining statehood. The autonomists did not see any tension between being a state of the Union and being autonomous. On the contrary, they saw it as and talked about it as the culmination of what they had sought. They said, you know what? Spain would not go there. And so now we've been annexed and we can achieve that kind of status under the American flag and
constitutional framework.
Yeah, and within the American constitutional framework. So it's a moment of it's a real lesson for how we should think about the American constitutional framework, that it accommodates people who yesterday were foreigners, who yesterday they were Spaniards yesterday, and they're Americans now. And the autonomists talked in these terms too. They said, we're still Puerto Rican. It doesn't change that. This doesn't change that.
Yep.
We're who we are. Now we want voting power. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think that provides an interesting segue, and I'll make a connection here. So what kind of put all of that push in check and on hold, in part, was obviously the passage of the Foraker Act, and then also the Supreme,
right? The first,
the Supreme Court considering the insular cases, right? And from that moment in the late 19th century to early 20th century, Puerto Rico had kind of an upward trend of increasing self-government, and that kind of culminated in the 1952 Commonwealth Constitution, where basically, for all practical purposes, Puerto Rico looks like it's a state for the purpose of the local governance. And for many people, on the island, they were essentially sold this idea that we had achieved local self-government. And there was a declaration by Luis Muñoz Marín, the founder of the political party that Hernández is now the leader of, that colonialism had been abolished, and that we have this local self-governance, and this Commonwealth is what it is, and it's the best of both worlds. We get to be U.S. citizens, but have our own local government and control local matters. And it's interesting because although I think the folks who supported statehood or supported independence with or without free association never quite bought into that, the bulk of the public in Puerto Rico did for many, many decades, and continued to vote for this political party under this vision of the Commonwealth, even if that wasn't completely clearly defined to them as a territory subject to the plenary powers of Congress under the territorial clause of the Constitution, right? So the moment that, in my experience, having worked in Washington, having worked for 2 governors, a resident commissioner over the last 20 years, was the culminating moment where that illusion, that bubble, that trance of Commonwealth being something other than a territory that is fundamentally colonial in nature, that moment where all of that was burst was when Congress passed the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board as part of PROMESA, which was a law to deal with the restructuring of Puerto Rico's debt. And they essentially took that 1952 Constitution and put on top of it this 7-member board that is nominated by Congress and then appointed by the president. And they get to decide on Puerto Rico's fiscal matters. They get to overturn local laws if it goes against the fiscal plan, which they've approved for the island. They get to decide how Puerto Rico renegotiates and restructures its debt in the capital markets. They get to do all kinds of things that essentially subordinate all of that local self-government, all of that autonomy that was supposedly achieved in 1952 to people who no one votes for in Puerto Rico, and no one can ultimately hold accountable. So I guess that kind of brings us
better than you did. Well summed up.
So that really brings us to the historic moment that we're in right now, because earlier this month, a very significant thing happened with regards to the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board that is now almost 10 years old, right? Which is that with the single stroke of a pen, the President of the United States essentially fired a majority of the board's members. And the reasoning for their dismissal was that they lacked efficiency and effectiveness, but it wasn't really explained in what or how or anything like that. And as of right now, the board has a single member sitting on it, so it lacks quorum and it can't actually make any board decisions. And yet the board still holds incredibly important powers over the government of Puerto Rico. It's functioning. It's essentially what approves the budgets for the island. It negotiates on behalf of Puerto Rico in front of the federal court that is overseeing its bankruptcy process. So, one question that I have for you is, how does the abrupt removal of 6 members of the Fiscal Oversight Board, what does it say about the ongoing democratic deficit of Puerto Rico as a territory?
As if we needed yet another reminder, right? I mean, it's the playing out of the situation that we've been in for decades, for scores of years, and for centuries. The United States is in control in Puerto Rico. And on top of it, we have a president who has a wildly inflated sense of his power, or I would say wildly inflated, except he's also getting away with implementing it. We didn't have a say in that selection either.
Yeah.
Here he is with the stroke of a pen, as you said, running the show on the board that runs our show. So it's like the United States doubling down on the
democratic deficit.
Yes, the democratic deficit and the colonial subordination. It's just, whatever one thinks of the board as a practical solution to the economic crisis, which needs a solution, its illegitimacy is fatal. And what's happened recently is just, more of the same, except more. More and worse of the same. It's, in this way too, you have no control over yourselves, your government, your so-called autonomy, and your future.
Yeah. And, in a recent interview to the press that I did on this topic, they asked, what is the reason why these board members were removed? And I think that the best answer that I can provide is that the president and his administration are doing in Puerto Rico what they've done in many other jurisdictions, many other areas of government, which is removing individuals that are not aligned with their particular policy preferences and views, and trying to replace them with individuals that will advance the ideological agenda of the president. And what that agenda is, honestly, remains to be seen. We really don't know exactly how those new appointments will play out. But I think what is absolutely clear from this episode is if having an oversight board in place that can be changed unilaterally by a single stroke of a pen, and it changes the governance structure and leadership of, Puerto Rico, if that's what you call autonomy, right? And that's the autonomism you're trying to promote if you are Resident Commissioner Hernández, and you're subject to that level of unilateral power, then at least for me, that's not the kind of autonomism I want. I want the autonomism that gives me the capacity to have a say in what laws Congress passes, and ultimately, who represents the executive branch of the federal government, which, we would have under statehood, but we don't have as a territory. That's my view on that.
Yeah, well, so first of all, it's mine too. And second of all, there's no system of government is perfect. We all know that.
Yeah.
U.S. democracy has plenty of problems, plenty of issues. The Supreme Court has been gutting the Voting Rights Act. There's, the gerrymandering is literally run amok.
On both sides of the aisle, for that matter.
I blame one side. Those Republicans in Texas are, it's unforgivable, really. Okay, so, it's not that it's perfect, but what we all have to do the most and the best that we can to ensure that people have an equal voice and genuine, achievable self-government. And so, to be presented with the option of gaining a voice in the federal government where you can get in there and, have your say and then vote on legislation and have that kind of power and leverage, and to compare that to a situation in which no matter how pretty the name, you are always at the mercy of what the federal government decides it wants or doesn't want. And you have no sort of entrenched, genuine, concrete power like you do if you actually, if you're voting constituents of representatives and senators with power, and if you have a say in presidential elections. It's not a panacea. Okay, sometimes people blame statehooders for they think statehooders talk like you get statehood and presto, all problems.
Everything happens perfectly. Yeah.
No, the problem that statehood solves is the lack of statehood. That's the only problem it solves. Okay, and what is that? The problem of a lack of realistic, reasonable, genuine, concrete power and genuine self-government and that amount of control over your destiny. You would still
and rights, but also responsibilities, which is something that right now under the territory status, we also lack because we don't have a full stake in the process of making decisions on behalf of the rest of the country, which every state inevitably does, because when senators or representatives vote on a bill, they're not just voting it for their state, they're voting it on behalf of America as a whole.
Right. So it is, I think, critical to engage with the most flattering view of one's opponent. And so, the Commonwealthers who would like to be known as the autonomists, but I can't go there because statehood is autonomy, and I'm an autonomist too, and I can't really be persuaded otherwise. But okay, so the Commonwealthers, I do think they have a vision that they believe is the best for Puerto Rico, the so-called best of both worlds. Okay, it unfortunately rests on a lot of slippery language and subterfuge, in my opinion. Okay, the best of both worlds. Both worlds are statehood and independence, and it is neither of those worlds. And
it is neither of those.
If there's something it doesn't have, it's the best of either. Okay, because it doesn't have representation, and it doesn't have the formal, complete autonomy that you would have as an independent country. So, they want something in between because they think, well, we're different from the U.S., but we're also part of the U.S., and we get some economic bonuses here, like, the loophole that allows Puerto Ricans not to pay federal income taxes. That's a big one, okay? People like that. And what they leave out is that Puerto Rico is so poor that most people wouldn't pay federal income taxes anyway. And what we should do is take the path that will revive that economy.
Exactly. So that people can actually develop economically, and then they can contribute based on the fact that they have more money that they're making, and their quality of life is improving.
Those who can contribute, then those in need will get full federal benefits, which they don't get without state, etc. So I think they're aiming for what they think is the best for Puerto Rico, but because it isn't possible in the way that they describe it, that is, you can't have guaranteed autonomy and genuine self-government unless you become a state or become independent, with or without free association. You cannot have it. Not under the U.S. constitutional system. You will remain a territory, and a territory is a colony. And so they, want to, we'll improve it here, we'll improve it there, we'll improve it here, we'll improve it there. And they end up, spinning it real positive. But when you spin it positive, you lead people to believe they can have something they can't have. And that's not fair. That's not fair to people.
And I think one of the fundamental things that is absolutely important is also that, we've had a new set of Supreme Court cases that have come out, kind of the second round of the insular cases. And Sanchez Valle, which, is the case that happened immediately around the time when PROMESA was passed, that basically said, Puerto Rico doesn't have its own separate sovereignty, right? Unlike the states, Puerto Rico's sovereignty ultimately rests in Congress. But there was another Supreme Court case, after that, which talked about the issue of whether or not federal benefits should apply to Puerto Rico on an equal basis. And in that case, the decision, and correct me if I'm wrong, basically said that anything that Congress can give Puerto Rico, it can essentially take away, and the only way in which, only justification that Congress needs to give for that is just, some kind of rational explanation for it, which is basically, it can say, well, they don't pay federal income taxes, so we're not going to give them, equal treatment.
Exactly.
Right. But ultimately, people in Puerto Rico aren't the ones who choose whether or not they pay federal income taxes. It's Congress. So Congress is able to justify its own unequal treatment based on the fact that it's treating Puerto Rico unequally. How does that make sense?
Yeah, that what you described is kind of the lowest bar that a court will use in reviewing legislation, as long as it's rational, meaning really as long as it's not crazy. And what does that mean? Because denying that case, the one you're talking about, Valle Madero, was about Puerto Rico's exclusion from the SSDI program. And frankly, to me, that is crazy. But in legal and constitutional terms, if a law is subject to rational basis review, that means it's the lowest possible bar. Congress really doesn't have to have a clear or reasonable explanation for what it's doing. Okay, famously, rational basis review doesn't even require that something be rational, and that's what the court said was the bar for Congress treating Puerto Rico differently. So,
so if you have autonomy and then they give you some special benefits or something that you think is the quote unquote best of both worlds, essentially what this says is that at any point Congress can just take that away.
Absolutely, I'll tell you. I do think that one particular flaw with the Commonwealth model that its leaders don't address, why would they, is that really it empowers a handful of leaders quite well. So they still live in a colony. They still don't have federal representation, but they get quite a bit of local power themselves if they achieve the autonomy they imagine. But if you think about it, that too is a distortion away from a Republican form of government, right? If Puerto Rico becomes a state, then you've got a governor and you've got senators and you've got representatives, and that power is distributed and they kind of have to work together, and that empowers their constituents. If Puerto Rico isn't a state, if it remains a territory, not only does it lack representation, and that has all the colonial problems we've identified, but on top of that, you've got the governor, then you've got the resident commissioner who has no vote in Congress. So, how much power is that? He's really got to beg for anything he gets. So we got to appreciate the fact there's somebody there to try to get Puerto Rico included when Puerto Rico needs to be included in some federal benefit or program.
And they can vote in committee, which is not insignificant, but it also isn't determinative, right? And it's still vastly less than what would be needed to actually have Puerto Rico have, equal.
Vastly less. But just at the basic structural level, under Commonwealth status, you've got the governor. That's really the person who's got the power in Puerto Rico. Yeah. And then the entire island has no power in the federal government. Whereas understated, you have power in the federal government, and you also have power spread out. Governors, senators, representatives, everybody here working for the people. So I just think structurally that difference also really weighs in favor of statehood and really undermines the argument that that the best form of autonomy is Commonwealth. It just,
I hadn't thought about it that way, and that is a fascinating observation that I think is really, really important, because ultimately, if Puerto Rico is going to improve its economic situation, bring more people to the island, really change, part of it is really making sure that there are more effective channels for the representational needs of island residents to be channeled. And it can't just be the government and a resident commissioner that can vote in committee but can't do anything on the floor, has no full House delegation like other states have, has no counterparts in the Senate. And ultimately, island residents don't have votes in the Electoral College, so they can't really have an influence over the executive that ultimately can make decisions that are life and death, like, whether or not or how to, issue a disaster declaration, or whether or not to send, service members from Puerto Rico to war if the United States goes into a military conflict.
As we talk about it, it really, the question becomes, why again? Why again? Why this Commonwealth thing? And that brings us back to where we started, which is Congress's role. Not that I want to steer the conversation. We'll go where you want to go, George. But I just want to say, I think a major, this is kind of my perspective, what my experience tells me, what I see, is that the United States failing to welcome Puerto Rico, make clear that we consider you part of us, and that we want you to have full democracy, full self-government, a vote, a voice, full representation, that the failure of the United States to do that loud and clear has a lot to do with why so many Puerto Ricans have taken the view that, forget it, we'll do our own thing. That's what happened back in the beginning, when the autonomists were all for statehood, and then Congress passed the Foraker Act, and they didn't grant U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans, which is why Degetau then, and so many others had to fight for it. They put us on a parallel subordinate track. And then they did it again with Commonwealth, put us on a parallel subordinate track. It's always, you guys can't really have equality. You can't have what we have. You've got to have your own quote unquote special thing that's actually less. And so, Puerto Ricans have gotten that message over and over and over and over. Just imagine what a difference it would make if Congress said, all right, enough of this, okay? We're ready for you all to be a state. You get to decide. You want to be a state? You want to be independent? You get to decide. But we'd love to have you, That's the world I really dream of. And then you'd know, what do Puerto Ricans actually want? What do Puerto Ricans think would really empower them? And allow them to flourish. I, by the way, you also asked, and I'm not sure that I fully answered it, about the question people ask about statehood. Wouldn't Puerto Ricans, lose their culture? And we started talking about the autonomists, who did not think they would lose their culture. There's literally a letter. I can't remember who wrote it. I think it may have been Degetau, who was like, if it's us, it's Puerto Rican. It doesn't matter if it's here or there. If it's us, it's Puerto Rican, because we're Puerto Rican. We're the ones who make the form of government Puerto Rican, because we're Puerto Rican. So there isn't a more or less Puerto Rican form of government for Puerto Ricans. It's the government we've got. And so, let's make it the best we can. But my view today is not just that statehood doesn't threaten Puerto Rican culture, because cultural influence comes already through, the same way that the United States has had cultural influence globally. It defies boundaries. It comes through television and movies and music and, art and all of that. That's where cultural influence comes from, okay? But I would go one step further and say, I actually think statehood, by empowering Puerto Ricans genuinely, is a better way to protect your culture, okay? And I wouldn't turn around and say, and with Commonwealth, you'll lose it, or with independence, you'll lose it. That's not the point. And I'm not trying to undermine independence in particular, which of course is a legitimate non-colonial option and would also protect culture to an extent. But you would still be under the shadow of the US. You would still be subject to cultural influence, And I think that being economically well and thriving and empowered and represented and not subordinate, that's how you defend your culture.
Definitely.
And so yeah, I mean, the answer, I'm with the late 19th century autonomists on this. But I just don't see it. I don't think, getting representation and a voice and a vote in the federal government will take your culture away. It'll just give you the power that you deserve.
Thank you so much for that. I couldn't agree with you more, and I really appreciate you providing this historical context to this ongoing debate, which is, of course, not just important to the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico, but it's really important to America as a whole, and particularly now as we prepare next year in 2026 to celebrate the 260th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I think that this is a moment where America as a whole, we need to reflect back on those core fundamental values that our founders laid out for us, and really think about how we can reaffirm those values and operationalize them in ways that really reflect the full potential of America. And in my view, an America where you have an offer of statehood or independence to the people of Puerto Rico is an America that really does reflect that value of government by consent of the governed that the founding fathers talked about. So hopefully that also helps give perspective to people who aren't Puerto Rican about why this issue matters beyond the shores of the island and those of us who are Puerto Rican who now reside stateside.
Absolutely. The founding fathers themselves did not do as well as they could and should have to implement their rightly articulated ideals, So, but they created what? An ever more perfect union. So, let's do better.
Definitely. All right. So just to wrap it up, one final question. What recommendation and advice would you give to supporters of Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rico statehood movement to advance this issue and gain greater visibility at the national level?
You saved the hardest question for last. You tell me. No, seriously, it's of course it's an uphill battle because the colonialism is structurally designed to be difficult to resolve because it's an exceptional status. It involves erasure. It involves invisibility. It involves you're not us. You're over there. We don't care. So people who care about Puerto Rico have to keep educating themselves, have to keep finding every opportunity they can to express themselves. If you live in a state and you know about Puerto Rico's situation, you've got a moral obligation to communicate with your representatives, to make it an issue that matters to you, to figure out how your representatives and senators have voted on this issue when it's come up and what they've said, and to hold them accountable if they are not doing everything they can to promote Puerto Rican decolonization. Okay, that's a privilege and power you get if you live stateside, and so you ought to use it. And in the meantime, we've got to speak our truth to anyone who'll listen.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Christina. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Likewise.
Continue doing the work that you're doing. It's amazingly important. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, George.